Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of two taster sessions for our knowledge exchange, which officially launches in September. Our outline for this evening is to share our philosophy around curriculum and to walk you through how we enact this in our schools. And we really hope that there'll be some useful takeaways for senior leaders, for heads of department, and also for classroom teachers. So we've tried to bear that in mind in how we've approached this. As a follow-up to the session, you will receive a link to the recording. You'll receive actually some PowerPoint slides and notes, which if you wanted to, you would be able to adapt it to deliver your own school CPD. So it won't be exactly the same as our presentation tonight. It will be more of a school-focused introduction to some of the ideas. And we'll also be sharing a document which has a list of really curriculum focused questions that you'll be able to use either in terms of your own curriculum planning just as a classroom teacher, or it might be something that a department or subject leader would find useful to go through with their departments, or even perhaps for line management between senior leaders and teachers. So we've tried to kind of make it so that you can adapt what we share afterwards that's to be relevant to your role and your context. Now, I'm wondering if Stuart Locke might be having an issue joining us, because I notice he hasn't turned his camera on, although is he about to appear on the screen? He is. Hi, Stuart. Our trust is really highly focused on curriculum, and obviously Stuart, as our CEO, is very influential in leading us on that work. So he's going to spend a bit of time starting off before we get into the specifics of how we do things at Advantage Schools. He's going to start by explaining how it is that we got here.
Thanks so much, Sally. Good afternoon to everybody. As Sally said, my name is Stuart Locke. I'm the Chief Executive of Advantage Schools, and welcome from me. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us in what's been a terrifically demanding term so far. Our schools are curriculum-led schools, and this predates Ofsted's focus on curriculum by some distance. I'm a fan of the direction of travel over the last few years in schools, including from Ofsted, and I want to explain why. In my early and mid-teaching career, i.e. over about 12 or 15 years, the dominant narrative was that teaching and learning fixes, leads, and is at the centre of everything. So if you wanted to sort behaviour, focus on the quality of teaching and learning. If you want to sort attendance, teaching and learning. You want to sort achievement, focus on the quality of teaching and learning. And the narrative was that if only we get teaching and learning right, everything else about a school falls into place. This has meant that the quality of teaching has been the thing that many, perhaps most head teachers are focused on. And hence they believe that to focus on it, you need to measure it. And if you're going to measure it, you need to join it. So you need to judge it, sorry. And so teaching and learning is, or was, said to be like the only thing that mattered in schools, the only priority that schools had. And a few years ago, I saw a head teacher quoted approvingly on social media who said, "Leaders do not allow themselves to be distracted from their core business of teaching and learning. Delegate the rest to others." Now, this has had some pushback over the last decade or so as schools that focus on culture and ethos have shown. I think, for example, Mossbourne Academy in Hackney, for all of its founder head's perceived faults, was a game changer in London that showed that pupils, including the most disadvantaged, could behave so that teachers can do their job. So my experience is that things are not fixed just with that focus on teaching and learning. I mentioned behaviour. I hold the leader of a school responsible for the culture and specifically the behaviour in the school. You can get behaviour right without sorting the curriculum, the subject of tonight's webinar. In fact, you must get behaviour right first or equal first, because a curriculum isn't a curriculum if it isn't learned, and pupils don't learn unless behaviour is great. Behaviour comes first, but when it's sorted and colleagues can teach without having to focus on how to engage enough, i.e. without the pernicious approach of if teaching and learning is engaging enough, behaviour is fine, then I think schools should focus a whole lot more, even than they appear to be at the moment, on curriculum. So I think teaching and learning, this might be controversial, is thought about too much in the abstract. Most schools, and hence teachers, think about how to teach a lot, probably to excess given the opportunity cost. And I want to refer back to an anecdote I've used a few times, which is from my maths PGCE in 1998. And on our first day, the group, including me, was sent home with homework. The homework was to watch Blue Peter. We weren't told why, and the next day we just had to discover why. So we talked about it for about 30 minutes and we couldn't work out why we had to watch Blue Peter. I thought there was something specific on that programme. After 30 minutes of trying to work it out for ourselves, our PGCE tutor told us, and incidentally, how common is that when pupils are set to discover something through the teacher's carefully designed lesson, and in the end, the teacher just tells them anyway. Anyway, we were told that Blue Peter's 40 years old back then. It had astonishing longevity. And we should notice that the reason for this is that in the 20 minutes or however long it was on, there were 9 different things that happened. If our lessons were to have longevity, we had to ensure that similar occurred in our lessons, i.e. that there were a variety of activities that were short in length and regularly changed. I used the analogy of Blue Peter approvingly in interviews and arguments for many years. It was my first experience of considering how to teach, and for the first decade at least of my teaching career, I was obsessed with getting better at delivering Blue Peter-like lessons. So some examples of things I've really done, and I hope if you did some of these, you're shuddering along with me for some of them. I had a 7-part lesson. I had things that had to include stickability. I don't even know what that means now. I had lots and lots of detached assessment for learning ideas. I used a broader range of questioning. I kept having that as my target in observations. Pose, pause, pounce, bounce. Hold call. Wait time. 1001 tips for outstanding lessons. Self-assessment stamps. Peer marking. Group work, but I was really clear that it had to be good group work, not bad group work. So it had to include roles for people in the groups. We had to have rainbow groups sometimes and things like that. Agreement timelines. Animations, PowerPoints, days of no PowerPoints, board work, visualizers, kinesthetic activities. I had a no pen day, I remember, a no table day, and so on. We really did those things. And I'm actually not saying that any of those things are necessarily inherently bad. You can make your own mind up about that. I'm saying that selecting and paying attention to these methods prevented us, at least in part, from looking at the what of teaching. What is it we're trying to get to the pupils? And we had to include many of them to match the variety of Blue Peter. The variety we need, in my view, is our subjects. Maths is probably one of those subjects that can be described as boring. You quite often hear parents or politicians even describing mathematics like that. And the Cockcroft report in 1977 said mathematics is a difficult subject to teach and learn. It is a difficult subject to teach and learn, but it's a beautiful and rewarding subject. This is arguable, I guess, at some points when you're learning it. I believe it to be far less arguable when you're good at it. Maths is an awe-inspiring, beautiful art when one is good at it, so it is the job of school to induct pupils into mathematics. But we don't talk about this as much as we should, because to a greater or lesser extent, and it is to a lesser extent nowadays, we're talking about how to make our lessons more Blue Peter-like. Our subjects are varied, and their distinctiveness is the beating heart of the school. We seem to want to remove sometimes what is great about them, their uniqueness, and replace that with some manufactured variety that is variation in the delivery rather than the substance of our subjects. And this criticism that I outline isn't new, and it's shared, I know, by a lot of people who are on the webinar this evening. R.S. Peters, reflecting the concerns of liberal educators in the 1960s, suggested that an understandable focus on the centrality of the child in education had led teachers to focus on the manner of education at the expense of the matter of education. I never heard the word pedagogy until several years into my teaching career. I didn't inquire as to what it meant for a while. I just carried on teaching maths. Then I was at the stage of my career where I decided to climb the greasy pole and become an assistant head teacher. So I needed to know stuff to get through the interview. But I genuinely thought pedagogy meant the science of learning. Then I thought it meant the science of teaching, and then teaching. And actually, I still don't really know exactly what it means. And I've asked a few people over many years, and you often get various answers where people say, yeah, I know what it means, and then they question themselves. And most people then look for their phones or their computers and go to Google it to define it, and there's long papers on what pedagogy means. Now, I've used the word enough times. I've been a head teacher, so I can clearly talk the buzzwords. But my criticism of the word is partly reflected by the fact that I believe it to be a weasel word, at least in how it's used. What I mean by this is that the word appears to mean whatever people want it to mean. And when they start to be specific about what they mean by the word, they don't need the word anymore. So I don't think we need the word pedagogy, not to a large extent because it's a weasel word. I do think we need the word curriculum, but we've again invented buzzwords around them, and you'll see the title of that tonight. We need to think about what they mean, and that's what we're trying to do today. I should say that I'm still prone to some of these buzzwords. So I want to claim that how to teach, or I think I've arrived at the conclusion that how to teach matters a lot less than what we teach. And to the extent that the how matters, it should be driven by the what anyway. I still don't think most schools think about curriculum enough. They think they do because they use the word curriculum now and they've got intent, implementation and impact statements on their websites. But think about what leaders talk about with regard to curriculum. Far more of the conversations are still about qualifications or exam prep, or which subjects the school can afford to put on to 16 or to 18, or how much time each subject will get, or the options process, or whether Key Stage 3 should be 2 years or 3 years, and whether that will get us through an Ofsted inspection, or how many, if any, pupils must take the EBAC, or how they will make sure that pupils are Progress 8 compliant. They will discuss whether to take an hour from PE to give to maths because the maths results weren't very good. Less often, there are leaders ensuring that in school, there is explicit, really hard thought about what pupils should learn and in what sequence. And this is what we must insist on where we can, trying to eliminate jargon. And while we're there, those three words, intent, implementation, and impact, I don't think we need those statements. Intent is that stuff that you've written down that you expect the pupils to learn. Implementation is how you get them to learn it, the teaching, the feedback, the homework, all those things. And impact is broadly the results, the extent to which they've remembered what they're supposed to learn. Like, I think that when we get caught up in jargon of that, like, I don't think we need to do some stuff explicitly for them. And we did actually, in our trust, not use those words when Ofsted came through with them for quite a long time. Although then we realised that we found them quite helpful, particularly the intent where it actually is describing exactly what it is. But I think we're at risk of making it a bigger thing than it needs to be. I think most things to do with teaching are subject specific and phase specific. And most people, I think, agree with that to some extent. It's rare to find a maths teacher, I keep talking about maths because I'm a maths teacher, who is as comfortable teaching drama as they are at maths. It's rare to find a secondary PE teacher who can teach a phonics lesson to early years. It's not even that easy to find a subject specialist in a secondary school comfortable with teaching all of years 7 to 13 in their subject. Primary and secondary teachers alike are quite defensive over their phase, and in secondary at least, though increasingly in primary, they're somewhat defensive over their subject. In my experience, primary schools have been crying out for more subject specialism, particularly in maths, humanities, music, art, DT, languages, and PE. I think I'm listing all the subjects now. We're starting to engage with the subject-specific aspect of this in our schools. The phase-specific has still got to come, I think, even more. But we've started to use new words in our schools, partly as a result of the training day we ran with Christine Council last year, and we need to be really careful about that.
Thank you, Stuart. So let's kind of move on to start thinking about what we actually do in our schools. I'm hoping that my screen is being shared and that you can see up here a little bit to add to the context that Stuart's given us. So before we start thinking about how we place curriculum at the centre of everything we do in our schools, we just want to start to think in detail about the meaning of some of that language that Stuart alluded to there. So what you see on the screen here is our trust-wide bet that we believe an academic, knowledge-rich curriculum is the best way to raise student attainment and aspiration. But what do we really mean, Stuart, when we talk about a curriculum being knowledge-rich?
Yeah, I think everybody says they're in favour of a knowledge-rich curriculum nowadays. And I think we need to be really careful that it's not just reframing perhaps some things from the previous era in new language to appear to do what we always did. It's a reaction largely to the era of the personal learning and thinking skills, where the content that was inside the curriculum, the kind of prize of the subjects, was really decimated 15 years ago. You had people with skills-based curriculums in some schools where there were no subjects at all. And to us, we think that the knowledge that pupils take from school is the real aim of education. We talk about our aim for our pupils to be to join the community of educated citizens. The idea that educated people have a load of knowledge that they take for granted when they're talking, and that you take for granted when you're reading a newspaper or reading a book, and unpicking what that knowledge is and how our subjects contribute towards that knowledge, and how we will make sure that pupils are included in that community by the age of 16 is really important. And of course, that assumed knowledge might change over time, but it has to be ambitious and have some root in the traditions of the subjects. So we spend quite a lot of time debating how we're going to make sure that our pupils are able to join a community of educated citizens, incidentally because we think that if they don't join it by the ages of 16, 17, 18, they're likely to be excluded from that community for life. And because we spend a long time debating about that, we just need to be careful that people don't talk, or that we don't talk about a knowledge-rich curriculum and focus on the proxies of a knowledge-rich curriculum, focus on the proxies of curriculum. So quite often you see people who will visit our schools and they'll say, do you have knowledge organisers? And can we have them? Particularly, do you have knowledge organisers in a particular subject? Now, we do have some knowledge organisers. They're the outcome of curriculum thinking. They're not the substance of curriculum thinking. And we don't have them in maths because there's lots of procedural knowledge in maths. There's fewer facts to summarise on our knowledge organiser. So we need to be careful that the proxy, the knowledge map or knowledge organiser, doesn't equal a knowledge-rich curriculum, but the substance of what it is that we want pupils to take away from them in terms of the knowledge of the disciplines and how the disciplines work is where we get to with our schools.
And I think as we move through, it will become apparent how important it is to actually go through that process of really thinking and debating what goes into the curriculum, and some of the thought processes that we can go through to help with that. So as a trust, our shared curricular understanding is really underpinned by the work of the people that you can see on the screen. And I'm going to go into more detail about some of their key ideas in a moment. One thing you may well notice is that not all of these thinkers focus entirely on curriculum. So there is some content on there on cognitive science, and that's really to emphasise the relationship that there is between curriculum and how pupils learn. So that is to say, the importance of thinking about key concepts that run through our curriculum and how we introduce and then reinforce that knowledge with pupils, how crucial that is to pupil learning. And that does come into our curriculum planning. And likewise, a good understanding of assessment is really important if we're actually to ensure pupils are progressing through the taught curriculum. So that's why we do also have a focus on aspects of cognitive science and of assessment theory as well. So the first person we're going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of influence over curriculum and our curriculum thought is Hirsch. Stuart, could you just maybe introduce sort of Hirsch in terms of vision, and maybe address some of the concerns that some people have when they talk about Hirsch's ideas?
I can try. I realise I always go off topic, Sally, so please stop me. But I just I actually thought, as you were presenting on the previous slide, the stuff about cognitive science is that can also come out as a proxy for like a knowledge-rich curriculum or curricular thought. But of course, you can use the insights of cognitive science to deliver a skills-based curriculum or a curriculum that's really empty of like substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And I think it's important for us to say that. On Hirsch, Hirsch was really influential to me. And I resisted him for some time, partly because of his reputation, because he'd influenced the previous Secretary of State, Michael Gove, and Michael Gove used him in speeches. And so there's an idea that he's somewhat particularly right-wing and so on. And actually, he's not. He's really interested in social justice. And I think that's an important aspect that Hirsch comes to us with. His book, I think it's a 1982 book, Cultural Literacy, is important because it comes from the standpoint that there's similar to the way I outlined before. There's a load of knowledge that educated people take for granted. We should make sure that they get hold of that knowledge. I think there are some concerns, and he would say there are concerns over that book in particular, back in Cultural Literacy, where he produced a list of things that every American should know. And he did so on the basis of what you need to know to be able to read the New York Times. I don't know if it was on a particular day or over time, but but I think that's that's somewhat deficient, and our view of kind of knowledge as fixed, as handed down like a traditional grammar school. I guess we're going to come on to Young in a bit, but like a bit of a future one view. And I think he recognises that that's not sufficiently. Well, firstly, actually, that why is it the New York Times that we chose, and why is it that, why is that the knowledge that we think everyone should go down with? And secondly, that there is some debate to be had within disciplines around that. So anyway, that's what. So I think Hirsch is really important. Chapter 2 of cultural literacy is absolutely brilliant, and I recommend it for a view on curriculum that allows you to get into this thought. But I'd be cautious about his lists and things like that, and replicating those kind of lists in our schools.
But also, I think, even though you're cautious about the lists, it's still worth engaging with his thinking.
Oh, absolutely, and his later work is actually, I think, much more accessible and makes a really clear argument. I recognise that because of Michael Gove's association with him, people can be reluctant to, but actually it's gone, like, I think it's really important to take this away from the, like, I'm really surprised that the Tories have been able to capture the idea that they're in favour of pupils from all backgrounds learning really powerful stuff.
Yep, sure. So this is going to be, a very kind of brief summary of some of the ideas that Stuart's talked about, but a real basis is that actually all pupils are entitled to knowledge, and that is everyone's entitlement. It's not some pupils, but we should make sure that we keep in mind that they're all entitled to it. However, some children will have gaps in their knowledge, and this can be labelled as a knowledge deficit. So there are things that are just missing, and Stuart particularly mentioned things that we might assume that educated people know that are just missing from some children's understanding. But the problem is that these gaps then make it much harder to learn new things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move through. But what we need to consider in our curriculum planning is actually, how do we take therefore those gaps into account? Like, how do we not assume that shared knowledge is in place, and how can we check what it is pupils actually know and make sure that we've planned a curriculum that serves those children, the children who might have the gaps in the knowledge, and making sure that they are entitled to that knowledge, therefore they can build their understanding as they move through the curriculum. So, as Stuart said, Hirsch kind of created the core knowledge curriculum, and this has influenced a number of schools in the US, and it's been influential over curriculum debate in the UK. But one of the kind of foundational things to think about is there's this kind of criticism of there being generic skills, and rather Hirsch would argue that procedural knowledge, or what we might see as a skill, actually stems from our background knowledge. So to give you an example of this, this is something that actually somebody told me about. So it was a friend of mine who was being like a reader helper in a primary school, and she was working with a pupil and they were reading a book, and she was trying to support the pupil in making inferences. So, kind of that general English skill of make inferences about the text, and that's how that we check a child has understood the text. Can they make inferences about what they read? And one of the parts of the story was that a family had gone for a day at the beach, but they decided to go home when the sand started to get annoying. So she was trying to draw out from the child what inferences they could make as to basically why would the sand be annoying the family at the beach. And she wasn't getting anywhere. The child wasn't able to identify any reasons that the sand would be annoying. So she tried to draw on the child's background, knowledge and experience to help them make the inference. So, well, have you ever been to a beach? And the child's answer was, no, I've never been to the beach. Okay, so that's not going to get us anywhere. So can you think about a time when you've played in a sand pit? And the child said, well, I don't think I've ever played in a sand pit. So she was like, you've not sort of, got any in your garden, or been out somewhere, or maybe been around a friend's house where they've got a sand pit. And they're genuinely, the child's like, no, I don't remember ever playing in a sand pit. Okay, so, and then she thought, no, you must have played with a sand pit, because we've got sand trays in reception. You must have experienced that in reception. She said, oh, what about in reception when you had the sand trays and you maybe would bury things in the sand? I didn't go to this school in reception. I don't remember it. Like, the child just hadn't, or at least they didn't remember any real experience with sand. They had never, or they'd not touched sand. They had no idea what it felt like. So it's basically impossible for them to make an inference about why a sound would annoy people. They could guess things about sound, but it wouldn't be based on knowledge of what sound feels like and how irritating it is when you're trying to put your sun cream on and the sand starts scraping your skin and gets in your food and all that sort of thing. No experience of that to draw on. So they weren't able to make inferences. So you could say, you might talk about that child and think that child has difficulty reading, that child has difficulty making inferences, but actually if the text they had reading was something they had some rich background knowledge of, they may have been able to make inferences perfectly well. So the skill that she was trying to assess in them, they weren't able to demonstrate because there were gaps in their knowledge and understanding. And something that we do with our staff to kind of talk about this idea is we show them a couple of texts. And it's great actually if you're working with people with a particular subject specialism, it's much easier to do this. And I'll just show you the kind of thing we might show them. So this is an exercise you can do with your colleagues where you basically can split the room in half, and you can say, I'm going to show you a text, I'm going to ask you how easy it is to understand, and I want you to give me a number from 0 to 10. So 0 is like it's not at all easy, 10 is it's really easy. And then you show them something like this. And you can probably tell after the first sentence or the second sentence that this is quite specialist knowledge that we're trying to draw on. And so normally what happens is you let them read through it, they look a bit puzzled by it unless they happen to share the specialism that this is based on. And then you kind of get them to look away from the screen, and all those staff members who weren't allowed to look at the screen before, they're allowed to look at the screen and go through the same thing. How easy is this to understand? But you show them this instead. And because this is about Shakespeare's Macbeth, the chances are if you've got some English specialists in the room, they'll definitely know it well. But most people probably have some understanding or some knowledge of Shakespeare, some knowledge of Macbeth, so they might find it a bit more accessible than the other text. But it's especially great if you do it with English specialists, because all of a sudden they're like, oh, this is super easy to understand. So you've got one half of the room who appear not to be able to understand a text, and the other half of the room that could understand it. And then you can kind of show them, well, actually, I showed you two different texts, but the point is, there's no difference in how intelligent you were between reading the two texts. There's no difference probably in your skills of inference if they were separate skills, but what there is there's a difference in your background knowledge that means that you could understand one of the texts much more easily than the other. And normally people are quite relieved when they realise that it was a very specialist text they were shown the first time, because they thought the other half of the room understood it no problem. And actually those two texts, if you run like the readability statistics on Word, where it tells you kind of the reading age, and it's all based on the number of polysyllabic words and high frequency words in a text, it's actually the Macbeth text which statistically should be the harder to understand text. And I think that's also useful to share with people as a demonstration of, but if you don't have the background knowledge that something's drawing on, it's really inaccessible to understand that. So that's kind of one of the principles we look at, really trying to establish that knowledge has a very important role to play in children's learning. But from there, what do we do? And a question that's rightly posed is, well, what knowledge? And I think the work of Michael Young is really helpful in attempting to answer what is actually a really knotty question. Stuart, do you want to talk a bit more about Michael Young and the idea of powerful knowledge?
I can try. I mean, my experience has been that since knowledge has taken a front foot in the last couple of years in terms of curricular thought, that we've started to have people use the phrase powerful knowledge, but on many occasions it's just like used as an adjective to like, it's not just knowledge, it's powerful knowledge. A bit like learning sounds quite boring, so we're going to say deep learning, but actually means the same thing. And Michael Young actually is really illuminating for me. At the same time, I referred to Michael Gove earlier on, but he also captured the view of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxists, who really believed that in order to challenge the rulers at the top of society, you had to at least be able to like, you can't challenge their ideology unless you know their ideology. And so there's something around that as well. To me, to Michael Young, he counterposed the idea of knowledge being like fixed in the manner that I described earlier on. And it was really illuminating when I read about this a few years ago. Like, so he talked about a situation of future one, he called it, where knowledge is fixed, It's handed down. It's like our traditional grammar school education, and it just is. That's it. That's the form we've had. And he counterposed that with Future 2, which he called, which is the idea that knowledge is constructed, that no one really knows what the most important stuff is. It's all down to the individual. Now, that second one is an era I think we were in the time when we talked about teaching and learning a lot. The idea that actually it didn't matter what the content was. What matters is that you developed skills and you kind of created your own content. I think that really caused a huge lowering of standards, particularly for those pupils, for those young people who might come from more disadvantaged backgrounds typically. And what Young would say is that those two things that sound dichotomous aren't actually dichotomous. He proposed instead Future 3, which he called powerful knowledge. And he defined this as knowledge which we don't acquire anyway. So pupils' powerful knowledge is knowledge that is not incidental to the pupil. They don't encounter it in their everyday life, so it needs to be taught. It's systematic and discipline based, i.e. it demands subjects basically, and it's organised through subjects, and it's developed by specialists. I guess the way I would say it is part of a quest for truth. So one of the things I've taken from Christine Council is the idea that each of our disciplines is a unique quest for truth, and that they have their own rules and their own development. And of course that allows us to start to think of a more dynamic view of the curriculum that isn't as static or as stale as we might describe the kind of old grammar school curriculum, but is more both more ambitious but also more aligned with the kind of academic subject that we're trying to introduce pupils to in order that they can join the community of educated citizens. And the idea that it's systematic and discipline based and it's developed by specialists, I think really answers the question of who decides like what knowledge we should be teaching our pupils. And the answer to that is us. Like, I think that's where we reclaim our professionalism as a profession, where we debate and argue a lot about what the most important content for our pupils is. For us, it's about like, how does it build so that you can join the community of educated citizens? How does it get the core kind of stuff that pupils need to know and the stuff they need to have encountered in order to be educated people and be able to participate in democratic society. And I think it's us as professionals, as subject-specific professionals where possible, and I recognise the difficulty this causes, particularly when I talk about phase specificity, but it's for us to debate that and to develop that. And that's our view of curriculum, and the reason that I think it needs to be talked about more. When I talked at the start of this webinar about the kind of how being talked about too much.
Yeah, and as you were talking then, I was just thinking about the professionalism of us deciding what knowledge, but also this idea of powerful knowledge is subject to change. And actually, when we are inducting pupils into, you know, it's their first introduction sometimes into a particular discipline, but being part of that discipline is how they in the future could shape that knowledge as well. And then it is about empowerment, isn't it, in that sense, but also the idea that for a lot of subjects, their time in school is very short compared to the huge nature of the subject. So enabling pupils as well to understand that this isn't everything, and that there is, you know, you're opening the doors essentially to a whole world of knowledge out there, and this is just their sort of first step on the journey.
They're quite like really important, and also really important, I think, that we don't get paralysed. I think that some of the really great curriculum thinkers, even like Christine Council, but also some of the people we've talked about, can really make it feel like you have to have a really like in-depth understanding of different subjects before you kind of have a go at kind of developing a more ambitious curriculum. We talk a lot in our trust about making our bets, right? And so I think it's really important to make a bet in order that you can argue about it and develop an iteration of the curriculum. So not only can you choose, when you say whose knowledge, not only can you, is it our responsibility to choose, but it's our responsibility to make our bets, or like which knowledge, like make that bet better as we go along. And I think you have to make a bet in order to, like, you have to stake a claim in order to
to be open to challenge and
exactly.
debate. Yeah,
Thank you,
absolutely. And so thinking about that, the next stage after that actually, and some of the buzzwords that we all hear mentioned around curriculum are like sequencing and having coherence in the curriculum. So once you've sort of established perhaps a broad base that you think you want to introduce pupils to, you know, we hear, don't we, in kind of talks about Ofsted, it's not just why have you taught this, but why is it here as well. And I think one of the ideas that we find quite useful to think about is from Christine Council, which is that idea of the curriculum as a narrative. Or Claire Seeley often talks about the curriculum being a box set. And I find that quite helpful because it's this idea that we don't just want to think about what we want pupils to learn as kind of isolated episodes, but actually how do we link their learning together over time to create coherence, but also thinking about ideas that might unfurl or develop as they progress through their learning, or things that might be interwoven. And I think that the result of that, like the result of a curriculum that has taken this idea, is very complex. Even though the idea itself, or have it as a narrative, sounds quite simple, you do end up with lots of strands in a curriculum that will be linked together, and sort of being attentive to that can be a really helpful way of managing the process of mapping out a curriculum. So thinking about the way like stories are structured, where you know there might be foreshadowing. So are you encountering an idea with your pupils for the first time, or are you developing a theme here? Are we referencing back? And just being aware of that. And I think especially this is something we talk about a lot with our primary schools, that idea that if you're the year 2 teacher, understanding where a student encountering some knowledge that you are bringing to them, understanding how it might be building on what's coming before, or might be actually forming the foundation for what comes later, is really important in getting it right. And I think it's quite a useful principle in curriculum design. And I think maybe that could come across as if you're saying, well, subjects should just teach everything chronologically. So history should be chronologically taught, but also when we teach music, we should do the same in music, we should do the same in art, that we just work through kind of what's happened from throughout time, and we pull some examples in. But that's not kind of what we mean by sort of building the narrative, partly because it won't be the same for all subjects. So in some subjects it may be really appropriate to think about a chronological approach, but in others you wouldn't be thinking about the narrative in the same way. And I know that kind of other things that people talk about in terms of what order they might do things in, they might start to think about interleaving aspects of the curriculum, or threshold concepts. I mean, Stuart, have you got anything to elaborate here on using those principles in terms of curriculum design?
I mean, totally. I said earlier that cognitive science can really be almost like the proxy for curricular thought, and I have come across colleagues who have said, like, also, what's your theory behind, or what's the reason that you've organised your curriculum like this? And they've talked about interleaving, and actually even interleaving as a principle in cognitive science I think is misunderstood. And I say that because I misunderstood it for a long time. I thought it was like mix things up. So a form of interleaving is you do maths followed by English followed by science, or like in maths you do a bit of algebra, then you do a bit of shape and space, and then you do a bit of statistics or whatever it might be. But actually, like, it was during we hosted the Learning Scientist, brilliant website if you want to get into cognitive science, but we hosted the 4 of them in Bedford a couple of years ago at Advantage Schools Conference, and the scales fell from my eyes when they said it's not just mixing things up, but it's mixing things up within a related topic or linked ideas. And as soon as that I realized, oh my goodness, like I'd completely misunderstood interleaving prior to this, it led to me realizing you can't really talk about interleaving without actually thinking about the subject again and getting back into like, what is it we want pupils to learn, in what order, like an interleaving being a useful strategy for pupils remembering what is taught to them. It needs to be something, it needs to be related in some way. And of course, that's really different in history to how it is in PE or drama. So we've got to be really careful about that. Threshold concepts is much harder. And I think it is worth thinking about threshold concepts as the kind of ideas within your subject that might open up whole new worlds. So in mathematics, the concepts of a limit or a function. But I also think we need to be careful about getting involved in the jargon with threshold concepts. Like I've seen them described as big ideas in history. I've seen a school just redefine every topic in mathematics as a threshold concept. And I've seen people talk about it being a common, like things that are held in common in the discipline in English. And I'm not sure whether we end up complicating things a little more than we need to. I found that the debate about threshold concept is insufficiently reconciled, so sometimes contributes significantly to the development of school curriculum. But I guess it's something that we do implicitly, and it might be worth unpicking. Like that stuff that I think is more obvious in mathematics, where if pupils don't know this, there's a whole load more of the curriculum they're never going to be able to access. And so we have to make sure they know that thing. I guess it's the core concepts that once they've grasped and they've overcome that threshold, they're able to access a whole load more. Sometimes actually outside of the explicit content that's being taught, but those core concepts could be important. But I do think that, like many things, if we generically say what are the threshold concepts in your discipline, we start to try to butcher or challenge the authority of the subject specialist. And I think we have to be careful about that. And I also think we can also introduce complexity where it's not needed.
Yes, be careful, basically. Yeah. So I think what we've been through so far is sort of established that when we are talking within our trust about knowledge, it absolutely isn't just chunks of information or just facts. So we do have a bit of kind of key language around knowledge that we share with staff, but often as well within our understanding of some of these key terms, there may well be a bit of debate. And actually, whilst that shouldn't be everything we do, like we're very wary of just sitting around all day talking about curriculum and not actually doing anything that benefits pupils, but having some discussion about what different terms mean can sometimes develop our curricular thoughts so that we can then think more carefully about our curriculum. So one of the things we're just going to focus on a little bit here is the distinction between substantive and disciplinary knowledge, because I think sometimes when people do think about a knowledge-rich curriculum, they sort of they might dismiss it as kind of, well, it's just a pub quiz curriculum, it's just kind of chucking knowledge at people. And actually, if you can get your head around kind of the difference between the substantive and the disciplinary knowledge, as well as some of the other things we think about, you'll see that it's much more than a pub quiz curriculum. So Christine Council identifies the difference between the two as substantive knowledge is basically what's given, the facts as they stand. Disciplinary knowledge is delving much more into what Stuart was talking about when he was talking about Michael Young, and she says it's what's up for grabs, or you can think of it as how do those participating in the discipline actually participate in the quest for truth and knowledge creation. And trying to understand disciplinary knowledge means hopefully, although not necessarily, we're less prone to the allure of genericism, because we have to accept that all disciplines are different, and if different subjects are introducing pupils to different disciplines, we can't really impose a set way of teaching on those subjects without in some way distorting the discipline. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. Yeah,
we've got to be a bit careful as well, haven't we, that we don't introduce genericism in where it's not where we think we're introducing some nuance. So I think disciplinary knowledge is a really difficult thing in some subjects. Actually, in Ruth Ashby's excellent new book on curriculum, which I highly recommend, she outlines how disciplinary knowledge, the rules and the operation for being a historian really relies on substantive knowledge. You can't teach one without the other, and you can't develop one without the other. So disciplinary knowledge and substantive knowledge flavour each other in history. But if you start to get into it in RE, so you're going to ask your RE teacher, to what extent is RE theology? To what extent is it philosophy? To what extent is it another of the social sciences, or a strand of history, or history of art? And that's really difficult to get into without a grounding in the subject. And I think if you go to some subjects and say, outline your discipline, the disciplinary knowledge in your subject, I think you might be heading down a path that is A, unnecessary, and B, really difficult for no benefit. I guess I'm saying the same thing there. So, and C, actually, the third thing is really difficult without a grounding in the subject. So I'm really aware that no, I think that's enough. I would just be very cautious about disciplinary knowledge and about saying generically that we need to be, we need to deal with disciplinary knowledge in all of our subjects, and consider that. And I do think actually, I rarely talk about Ofsted, but the Ofsted subject reviews are really helpful actually in this. They're really helpful to just have a read of.
Yeah, so it may well be relevant to talk about it with a history teacher, not so much with an MFL teacher, for example.
Maybe.
Yeah. So do you think, like, obviously, should senior leaders in a school who are managing curriculum and are trying to understand and have the job of ensuring that pupils get a good deal in their schools, like, how important is it for them to understand what the disciplinary knowledge might be in a subject, especially if they're line managing them?
So I'd just say, I made a commitment on social media like a few months ago to read a book in every discipline, and I read one about kind of debates in geography, and a head teacher or senior leader who's a geographer said, like, it would be my worst nightmare as a head of geography to go into a line management meeting with you having just read that book, because like you'll think you know more than you do, and I don't want to get into those debates with you, and so on. And so I think we need to be super cautious about it. But I do think that you can't flavour the questions, the sorts of things you're going to send out, Sally, to the participants in this webinar. You can't flavour those questions with any kind of sense of like understanding what people are talking about, unless you undertake the meaty, difficult work of understanding the disciplines. I think one of the things that was really positive there was I asked our head of history which book, what I should read for history, and he gave me about 7. But the point being that actually he was able to unpick how I might have an understanding of the discipline that's flavoured. It flavours my understanding sufficiently to be able to participate in the conversations about curriculum with him. So really difficult.
So what would this mean for our primary colleagues who might be actually teaching subjects that they perhaps even dropped at GCSE?
Yeah. So our experience is that this is like, it's almost like it's even more difficult still, right? So primary, it depends what approach we take, and it depends. You might be lucky in primary and have a specialist in each of the 14 subjects that you're teaching, but it seems quite unlikely. And in most cases, actually, there are subjects that are really difficult to develop and have and do so to the extent that we're suggesting in this webinar. And I don't think there's anything wrong with purchasing, borrowing, or providing resources and a curriculum that has been developed by specialists. But I still think it's the responsibility of subject leaders to, as much as they can, and our head teacher at Elstow School does this, to as much responsibility as they can to get into the substance of the subjects in order to be able to flavour the discussion about how good the curriculum that they're delivering is, and also to get into that discussion with the subject leaders in primary who often aren't subject specialists in the subject they're leading. Like, we've got to embrace that challenge if we're going to put curriculum in the middle and make the difference that we want to make in terms of, it's such a crucial phrase in terms of like our aim to get kids to join the community of educated citizens.
And actually, you just talked there about putting curriculum in the middle, and this is really what we try to do. It is pretty central to all our systems and processes. And some of the areas we'll talk about tonight around professional learning and conversations, and some of the follow-up resources that you get will hopefully exemplify for you how we try to do that. And some of the things we'll talk about in our next webinar around quality assurance and how we deal with data, which is quite unusual in our trust. And how curriculum, they are the servant to curriculum essentially. So that's what we'll focus now a little bit on professional learning and those conversations. But obviously bear in mind all of this is interlinked. So as I move forward, I sort of think about very much how our quality assurance systems are part of those professional conversations, which hopefully then is a curriculum development conversation. So it is quite difficult sometimes to pull all of the different aspects of what you do in school apart. But I do kind of take that as a sign that we have effectively wedged them all to curriculum and made sure that they are working to serve the curriculum. Did you want to add anything to that, Stuart, before I start
Yeah,
talking about professional learning?
Like I think it's really a very early stage. We said that any of these things, quality assurance, professional learning, like data reporting, they can all turn it around really easily and drive the curriculum. So it doesn't start with curricular thought, it starts with curriculum serving those things, particularly with perverse incentives, which are often present in schools without us realising. So I think it's really important to be aware of those things. And the drive often is to make things similar, so it's easy for senior leaders to either QA or to deliver to whole staff, or to have like a set load of questions they're going to ask in conversations. I think great curriculum-led schools must have written into their procedures, and I think the minute we did this was a really crucial one, that the subject is prized, and that there is a tension between being able to grasp what people do in subjects other than the ones you know explicitly, and allowing them to opt out because they probably know better. I do think it's important that we have written into our policies that if it damages your subject, ignore this policy.
Literally is written into our policy, that phrase. I think it's put a bit more bluntly than that, actually. So in terms of professional learning, we have a curriculum for our professional learning in the kind of the things that we really want our teachers to know and to be able to do, and then we've thought about how to effectively sequence it. So it means that the staff in our schools have actually all worked through the 3 phases, which are basically behaviour, curriculum, and then the science of learning. So when we have a school join our trust, or when we have new staff go through induction, we'll make sure that they've covered that curriculum too, because obviously we want that shared body of knowledge between our staff to inform their professional conversations. So we look at behaviour first, but then we very much think about our focus on curriculum. And the reason we put behaviour first, I think Stuart alluded to this in his introduction, is even with the best will in the world, you can have an amazing curriculum, but it won't be effective if pupils aren't attentive to their learning. And then following curriculum design, we look at the science of learning, so that hopefully what we've got then is teachers really thinking about their subjects, their discipline, their curriculum, what's kind of optimum in terms of the way that they would teach that within their subject, rather than the pedagogy driving their subject content. And once we've kind of got that induction in place, it's very much bespoke learning, where we entrust our subject leaders and teachers to direct their professional learning much more. And that's something really that professional conversations can become part of professional development. So what we do is we give our subject meeting time, for sort of administrative meeting time, is given over to subject specific professional learning, and that can take many forms. It might be a head of department or an experienced teacher using the time to coach another member of staff. It might be to do collaborative planning around their curriculum resourcing. It might be inviting an external speaker in. There are lots of different ways they can use that time, but the focus will be on the subject. And actually this does apply in our primary school too, where really a lot of the professional learning is subject specific and is about the subject leader presenting on the curriculum vision, ensuring that everybody feels trained and supported in how to actually enact the curriculum in their classrooms, and ensuring that everybody comes together as well, so that they understand where their particular segment in that child's curriculum journey fits into the much bigger picture. And we do try to make sure that our professional learning has been effective by actually auditing staff. We check their understanding, because like the last phase, the bespoke stuff, is the really exciting stuff, but it's very challenging. So we really want to make sure that people have got, as we would with our pupils, a really good understanding of the foundations before they can move forward. So it's about taking that generic stuff or the kind of curriculum vision stuff, but actually really thinking about what does it mean in my particular subject area. You will see when you get the PowerPoint slides afterwards that you might want to use in your schools how to use these slides, but you've kind of got some representations of a knowledge deficit, meaning that you haven't got a secure structure. You've got the idea of a pub quiz curriculum where you just throw loads of facts at pupils represented by the bricks. Doesn't give you a secure foundation either. So if we want a really secure foundation, we must think about sequencing. And that would mean that we would ask our teachers to sit and think as subjects about backwards planning. So what do pupils need to know to be successful at the next stage in their journey, like way beyond where you teach them? And then what do they need to do to be successful wherever you are? So what do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do? And then how can we really break down isolate, practice, repeat and build that knowledge to prepare them as best we can, whilst promoting a love of our subjects as we do it, because our teachers are amazing subject specialists and we know they really value their subjects and want that to come across to their pupils as well. So we would ask teachers, amongst other things, but these are the types of questions that they might reflect on as part of the professional learning that they do. I'm just going to let you read this quotation, which is from Stuart, which is a bit weird to put a quotation up from someone who's talking to you, but because we show this to staff. And hopefully reading that, you're kind of thinking, okay, this probably fits into somewhere around the things that we've talked about with regard to Michael Young. And then we would say to them, okay, so let's have a look at your curriculum. Are these the most important things? And are they going to enable pupils to join that community? And what values do they express? And actually, is anything missing? Stuart, you look like you want to speak. Do you want to say something? Okay, that's good, because we're getting close to the end of time. And then one of the outcomes of this work, and part of actually that bespoke subject development that we look at, and was a way we really wanted to strengthen and empower our middle leaders, but also to enable SLT to have much more curriculum focused conversations with particular subject areas, was to, and this is something we kind of initiated over the last year, to formulate some teaching approaches documents. So I believe the idea came from Michael Fordham, but we also had some discussions with Tom Bolter at the River Learning Trust, who was also kind of using this approach. And what we did actually was, what you have on the screen here is two very different approaches to one subject, and these were kind of to exemplify, we're not telling you this is an approach you should use. We really want to know what you think, what you're kind of, hopefully in a department you would discuss it and you would come to some kind of consensus of what you think really good quality teaching of your curriculum might involve. What are the debates, and what are your bets around it? And so then departments worked collectively to write their teaching approaches document. And I guess one of the things we talked about earlier was that sort of idea that of the senior leader who reads a geography book and then goes in and thinks they know all about geography. This was to try to mean that senior leaders can work with their departments with some humility and say, actually, you're the expert in this subject. Maybe it might be you want me to read some particular books, but also you're giving me your reasoned view, and I should be able to discuss with you and dig a little bit into the reasons that you've made these choices. So actually the active discussion within departments, but then really rich conversations with senior leaders, meant that we've all been involved in and able to understand some of that discussion and debate. And obviously this then can form part of our quality assurance processes, because we're very clear that there is no point to quality of assurance other than to ensure that the education is of an excellent quality. And that may sound very obvious, but we do always try to make sure that anything we're doing would lead back to that. And this is basically what we will cover in our next webinar, which you should be able to access the registration link in the chat. But we will be looking at how we use things like data-driven instruction, where we really dig into what do we want to know and what do we want to avoid around pupils. So I know I'm not giving you time to read this now, but that's because it's going to be the focus of 2 weeks' time, our next webinar. And also we'll be talking much more about the idea of the curriculum as the progression model, and what is it that you actually want to assess when you are looking at curriculum. Either short-term or long-term learning that you want to look at. So that's just to give you a sense of how the next session links to this one, because it's very much about building on what we've talked about tonight, but talking much more about QA and assessment processes. So Stuart might have something to say in a second, but I'll just point out that you can join us for our next one. As I said, the link is in the chat function, and if you want to hear more about the knowledge exchange itself, the network, I've also posted the link to our webpage in there, so you can have a look, and you can also sign up from there as well. Stuart, did you want to add anything to what I've just
two things,
through?
if that's all right. Yeah,
yeah,
so first is like, we haven't got time for questions, I realise that, but our contact details are on the Ask website, right? So we're happy to answer questions if people have them. And second is just to say about DDI, a low stakes form of assessment that's systematized across the school. The QA is our school, with low levels of workload is the thing that most people want to take away and understand when they visit our schools. So it's really worth getting into that in detail.
Yes, and also you will, I think you'll see a link to the survey with the email that you get automatically from Zoom. So if there are any specific questions you would have loved to have asked tonight, you can ask them and we can address them when we see you again in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much for your time this evening. We really hope it's been useful. Do give us feedback in the survey as well if there's anything that you think we could have done better, and we really hope to see you in a couple of weeks.